So there's a lot of opinions about obesity. The idea that it's caused by overconsumption of fat or overconsumption of carbohydrates. However, I've yet to see anything about the overconsumption of protein because it is simply extremely difficult to do. So tip number one is increase your protein intake. But that's not necessarily what I wanted to touch on. So one of the very common theories of obesity is called the insulin theory of obesity. Insulin is a hormone that's produced when our blood glucose is elevated. And the things that are going to elevate our blood glucose are eating dietary carbohydrates or an abundance of dietary protein. And this is typically if you're getting above 80 grams of protein in a single meal. But for the most part, the things that will raise our blood glucose the highest are going to be carbohydrates. And transiently, when we produce insulin will bind to the cell and allow these carbohydrates, even fatty acids and proteins, entry into the cells. It will also transiently inhibit some of the enzymes responsible for burning body fat. Which means technically if it was possible to inject someone with insulin all day long, and they always had a continuous supply of glucose, and somehow maintain their insulin sensitivity all day long, they likely wouldn't burn any body fat because the insulin would inhibit this process from occurring. And conversely, if you eat a higher fat, very low carbohydrate diet, then because these nutrients typically will not raise insulin, you'll be able to burn body fat all day long. And don't get me wrong, there's a ton of other hormones, peptides, neurotransmitters, and other molecules inside of the body, other than just insulin, that will be affecting this process. But when you look at it from the frame of strictly looking at insulin, because lower carbohydrate diets don't increase insulin as much, the thought is that you'll be able to burn more body fat. And then if you eat a diet high in carbohydrates, because it will increase your insulin level so much, it will inhibit you from taking body fat out of storage. But when we actually compare these two diets, as long as protein and calories are equated, they get the exact same results. And now what could be the possible mechanism for this? The thing is that when you're eating a very low insulin diet, which would be higher in fat, lower in carbohydrates, you will be burning a lot more fat throughout the day. However, you'll also be storing a lot more fat. And in terms of a higher carbohydrate diet, yes, you will technically burn less fat throughout the day. However, a study published in the Journal of Clinical Investigation, they put their patients in a caloric surplus by overfeeding them on carbohydrates. And on average per day, they stored about 282 grams of fat. But they found that only 4 of these grams of fat came from turning carbohydrates into fat. And this is referred to as de novo lipogenesis. And the only reason I tell you this is to demonstrate that it's a lot more difficult to actually store carbohydrates as body fat. One of the biggest reasons that carbohydrates can cause you to gain body fat is because for an acute period of time, they inhibit fat burning and they increase the storage of fat. But the glucose itself is typically diverted to glycogen storage and energy use. So if we're eating a higher carbohydrate diet but a lower fat diet, and this isn't taking into account the nutritional composition of the diet or some of the long-term hormonal changes that can occur, as long as everything is functioning properly, you will burn less fat, but you'll also store much less fat. Which is why, again, when you look at it and compare the two diets, there may actually be a difference in what you can refer to as the fat flux, meaning the amount of fat that you store and burn throughout a given day. It seems to all end up equating to the same net outcome. However, in terms of body composition, one of the things that you may actually want to avoid is overeating on both carbohydrates and fat at the same time. And if you really take a look at the most obesogenic foods, these are foods that contain high amounts of both carbohydrates and fat. And certainly this is because they have psychological effects that make them very easy to overeat on. And the real harm is going to be when you're overeating and overconsuming energy. But eating an abundance of dietary fat at the same time that we have elevated insulin levels will make it much more likely that this dietary fat will be diverted directly into fat storage. And then the glucose will be used for energy and glycogen storage. But it really depends on your goals. Because if it's after a workout, this could even be a beneficial thing. And the reason I say this is because our muscles have what are referred to as intramuscular triglycerides. And these are simply just fat stores inside the muscle that we tap into when we're exercising. And they also have muscle glycogen, which is carbohydrates that we use when we're exercising. So a meal containing a small amount of dietary fats and a larger amount of carbohydrates after a workout can allow us to actually replenish some of these intramuscular triglycerides and replenish muscle glycogen a little bit better. And because it's coming directly after a workout, it can give you a little bit better chance to actually store this fat inside of the muscles instead of inside of adipose tissue. But one of the reasons that obesity plagues many people is because they are eating in this pattern without the stimulus of any sort of exercise. So the fat is directly diverted into adipose tissue. And I understand this is a very simplified version of a very complex process. And I certainly understand that there are going to be people that disagree. However, I just wanted to make this video to demonstrate that the real issue is not which macronutrients you are choosing to eat most of the time. Given that you're eating sufficient protein, what really matters is the amount of food that you're eating in general. You can lose body fat on a high carbohydrate diet or a high fat diet. And you can lose body fat on a mixed diet. You just need to find what works best for you. But I still can't find a good reason not to eat your protein.